Hey everybody, this is Mr. Kelly. I wanted to do a screencast here to introduce phrases, and this should also be a good tool for you to go back and review, both for any quiz that we're doing as well as the midterm exam. First up, we have the positive phrases, and honestly, appositive phrases are probably the easiest out of the four for you to identify. Any assessment we do is just going to ask you to say, what type of phrase is this? And the appositive ones are pretty simple because you're always just looking for a noun phrase that is right next to the noun that it is describing or renaming. So let's look at our first example here. We have Mr. Smith, an English teacher, drove to work through the blizzard. Now, an English teacher is our positive phrase there. It's right next to our subject of this sentence, Mr. Smith, and it is renaming that. And so we could see here that could be removed from the sentence. We could just say Mr. Smith drove to work through the blizzard. Mr. Smith did not have a snow day, apparently. And so that appositive phrase is, again, it's a noun phrase. It's right next to it. It's renaming it. As we can see from our second example here, it is possible for an appositive phrase to either be before or after the thing that it is describing. And generally speaking, the more specific, like the prop, so here Mr. Smith would be the more proper noun, the subject of the sentence, because it's more specific, whereas both of those in italics are providing additional information. Next up, we have the prepositional phrases. A lot of you, when you were younger, probably memorized preposition songs. If you did, great. If not, I am not requiring you to memorize any songs. However, what I would recommend is that you look up a list of prepositions. We have some common ones for you right here. At, by, for, from, in, etc. This is not going to turn into 5 minutes of me just reading prepositions at you. Look at a list, and it's pretty easy to see the type of word that prepositions are. There's two parts of a prepositional phrase. Well, I mean, there's more. There's two real important parts to the prepositional phrase that I want you to be aware of. The first one is the preposition itself. The second one is the object of the preposition, which is a noun that ends the prepositional phrase. And so prepositional phrases are providing more information as adjectives or adverbs. For example, here in example number 1, in the tank is our prepositional phrase. It's providing more information about the fish. So the fish in the tank hid when the evil scientist slammed the door. That's providing more information there. It's describing the fish and saying which one. In example number 2, Mr. Smith washed the board again before class. Before is our preposition here. In both of these, we have our noun, that is the object of the preposition. And so those are also pretty easy for you to get once you get the hang of recognizing what a preposition is. The next two, so basically I think we could do a quiz on appositive phrases and prepositional phrases right now, and just about everybody would put up an A on that quiz. The next two are where it gets a little bit tricky, because the next two are about verbals. And so a verbal is when we have a verb form that is functioning as something else. In this case, we have participial phrases and gerund phrases, and I want to talk a little bit about both of them together, and then we'll break down them individually. And so the biggest thing when it comes to the participial and the gerund phrase is that we have to figure out what function is this phrase performing in the sentence. If the phrase is acting as an adjective, if it is describing a noun next to it, then we have a participial phrase. They always function as adjectives. A gerund phrase functions as a noun. It's usually going to be a subject or an object of a sentence here. And so there's one easy trick. We'll talk about that one first, and then we'll get to the tougher stuff. The easy one is this. If you ever have a past tense verbal, then it has to be a participial phrase because it has to be an adjective. So for example, in this one, attacked by raccoons, we wish that we had camped somewhere else. In this case, even though attack is usually a verb, it's being used in a phrase here to describe the subject of the sentence, which is we. If it's a past tense, it's got to be a participial phrase. The problem is these three letters right here. ing. There we go. When we see a verbal ending in an ing, that means that it could be either a participial or a gerund phrase. And this is where it gets a little tricky. Because here's where we can't just look at a clue from the sentence. For the appositives, if we have commas and a noun right next to it, we know it's in a positive. For a prepositional phrase, once we spot that preposition, we realize what it's doing in the sentence, it's pretty easy to pick out. Past tense, again, we know it's a participial phrase. But if we have an ing in the sentence, then it could be either a present participle or a gerund. And so we have to figure out what function is this performing in the sentence. So let's take a look at that. Here, with our participial phrase, the student dancing into English class is excited to learn. And so here, this phrase, dancing into English class, is a participial phrase because it's describing student. That's not really a great arrow. There we go. It's describing student. We could say dancing into English class is fun. In that case, it wouldn't be describing anything. It would be a gerund. And so the same exact phrase could be either a participial or a gerund phrase, depending on how it's being used in the sentence. We'll look at an example of that later. So one way that we can figure out, hey, is it a participial phrase? We look at, is there a noun right next to it that this phrase is describing? Another way that we can figure out, is this a participial phrase, is to question, could we remove this from the sentence, and will the sentence still make sense? So for example, with this one, if we just cut that out of the sentence, and we just said, the student is excited to learn, was that still a complete sentence? Yes, it is, meaning it's an adjective. It's something that is providing more detail, but it's not totally necessary. And so that gives us a hint, hey, it's an adjective, it's a participial phrase. We can't remove gerunds and still have them make sense in almost every case. Let's talk about gerunds for a little bit. A gerund is functioning as a noun. And so whereas our participial phrase is describing a noun right next to it, our gerund phrase is functioning as a noun itself. In example number 1, running away from bears is our gerund phrase here, is a great way to get in shape. This phrase is the subject of that sentence. It's functioning as a noun. Here in example number 2, we have a gerund phrase as the object of the sentence. Adventures in mountain climbing require training for many months. Again, we see here, is this describing, with this one, example number 1 in particular, is this describing a noun around it? No. Does it make sense if we pull it out? If we just had is a great way to get in shape, well, no, that doesn't make sense. And so that shows us that it is a gerund, that it's a noun phrase. Let's look at one last example here. And so our phrase here is eating lots of ice cream. Same exact words used in 2 different ways. I'm going to wait for 1 second, or you can pause here. Can you figure out which one of these is a participial phrase or which one is a gerund phrase? If I was more technologically skilled, this is where I would play the Jeopardy theme, but I already made this video once and messed up the recording and had to do it over again, so I'm not going to risk additional technology. All right, that's enough time. Here we go. The top one here is a gerund phrase, because that is functioning as the noun, the subject of this sentence. Eating lots of ice cream is one of my favorite summer activities. That phrase is functioning as a subject there. Subject is that phrase. Perfect. And then here we have is our main verb. Down here, we have our participial phrase. I walked past students eating lots of ice cream. In this case, eating lots of ice cream is describing students, that word right there. It's functioning as an adjective. And so remember, gerunds always function as nouns. Participial phrases always function as adjectives. That's really only going to come into play when we see those ing phrases. Everything else, we have some easy ways to figure it out. Again, appositives, they're right next to a noun that they're renaming, and they are a noun phrase. There's no verbal presence in the appositive phrases. Prepositional phrases, we try to recognize the preposition. We can see what it's doing in the sentence. If we have past tense, we know it's a participial phrase, but when we run into that ing, the present tense verbal, then we have to figure out what role is it playing in the sentence. We're going to go over this in class. I'm around after school if you need any more help with this, but that should be a good introduction/review. Have a good one, everybody.